These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. And now with maps. You'll see them if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, but if you're audio only, you can get a map over at oldeststories.net to help with all these names and locations if you like. Anyway, as Adad-nirari's reign wraps up here right around 890 BCE, the Assyrian Empire is basically now established in all its most important aspects. I mean, sure, the territorial borders have a long, long way still to expand, and there are potentially millions more people just waiting to get slaughtered or displaced over the next 2 centuries. But the core ideology and methods are already in place. The empire is divided into 2 parts, the core districts and the outer tributaries. The core districts, which are basically the places that are ruled and owned by the Assyrians, these are the land of Ashur, that being here the god Ashur. And each district is required to pay tribute to the god Ashur. Each district paying in theory an equal amount to the god, regardless of the size of the district, because each district is equally part of the land of Ashur. And at least in theory, each district, regardless of geographical size, is sized approximately to have about the same economy as each other district. This doesn't actually happen in practice, but that's the idea. The tributaries, meanwhile, these are the lands not actually owned by Assyria, but which have given submission to the empire and are allowed to keep their local rulers so long as those rulers pay a regular tribute to the Assyrian king. Now, this isn't just an ideological split, though ideology is a part of it. It can be sort of kind of hard to tell tributaries from core territories in the sources sometimes, and so a lot of the maps that you see, including often mine, aren't really clear about which areas are tributaries and which areas are districts. But more important is that people who are within the borders of Assyria proper are, to a degree, as far as the government is concerned, Assyrians. Even though we saw at the end of last episode that the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic characteristics of these Assyrians get increasingly diverse over time. Not all Assyrians are equal, of course, and there are the people who are both Assyrians and not Assyrians, depending on the context that you're looking at them. But I mean, people all being equal, that's just not a thing that you're going to find on any wide scale in the ancient Near East, pretty much at any point. But they are all people of the god Ashur, which makes them, on one hand, all equally the moral responsibility of the monarch and equally resources to be harvested. We see the Assyrian kings balance this compassion and harvesting with frequent gardening metaphors, where the king is the benevolent gardener, building a beautiful imperial garden out of his people and lands, which delights all who are within the garden. And, you know, sometimes you just pluck some folks off a tree and you eat them, because they're just resources. But if being within those districts makes you the property of the god, being outside those districts makes you the property of the king of Ashur. Everything outside of Assyria is something that the king can plunder. Today we're going to see that many nations rightfully fear the might of the Assyrian war machine and preemptively offer up the plunder in the form of tribute, making them essentially self-plunder their own nations to avoid the rather harsher plundering that the Assyrian army can very easily accomplish. And to get on a bit of a tangent, on top of our tangent, even before getting into the history today, this is a rather interesting inversion of the so-called stationary bandit theory of government, with interesting ideological implications. You see, there's a theory in political science that we can imagine a state of nature before governments and such had been invented. In this land, most people are peaceful and productive, but some turn to violence to enrich themselves through theft and plunder. These violent people eventually encounter other violent people and they form organized violence groups to protect themselves from other violent people and also to more effectively plunder the peaceful. What happens is that a particular violent group will outcompete all the other violent groups in the local area, so they now have a monopoly on violence to get whatever they want. So they settle down in this secured area and make themselves into the first kings and governments. However, one thing that happens to these settled bandits is that they realize that they need to be more kind to the people they are plundering than the mobile bandits. If these stationary bandits take everything and kill everyone, then nothing will be left, and eventually they too will starve, being parasites who've killed the host. Recognizing this, these settled bandits then undergo a process of experimenting with different levels and types of taxation to see just how much they can shear the sheep without skinning them. Sometimes the settled bandits are challenged by roving bandits who can usually plunder more than the settled ones, since they can move on to new targets over and over again. Sometimes we see the settled bandits acting settled in their own region, but they act more like roving bandits outside of it. And the metaphor can get pretty complicated, but it holds quite well as a model for most state-like entities in the ancient Near East, though not all. The Assyrian Empire, however, it represents sort of a new twist on all of this. In theory, the king of Assyria is no longer taking taxes from the people of Assyria. He's now a settled bandit, gaining no theoretical benefit from his lands. Instead, he's getting all of his plunder from outsiders, who he can, in theory, plunder as hard as he wants since they're not his lands. While the people of Assyria are still paying taxes, since taxes are a universal constant, they're paying them to the god, and thereby funding a different class of state expenditures, a mix of religious and public development. Now, I won't say that Ashur-Dan explicitly saw his kingdom in terms of modern political philosophy. That would be anachronistic. But I do think it explains something interesting about the empire, its famous brutality in war. And it at least claimed and sometimes actuated benevolence towards often the exact same people that it had just been brutal towards, separated only by the fact that they are now entered into Assyria, whereas before they were outside of it. The king was now conceived within his own territory as a steward, acting on behalf of the god, not owner over all that he surveyed. Outside his territory, he sees the world in terms of things that he can take for himself, and psychological warfare exercised through brutality is just a means towards accomplishing that goal. Now, of course, the settled bandit isn't the only political philosophy framework that we could see the empire through. There's also government as family, there are social contract dimensions, both of which are definitely operative in various ways throughout the ancient world. But the settled bandit idea, and its unique reframing in the Assyrian context, produces something I think is really striking. But you know what else is really striking? The Babylonians are really striking. They're really striking at the southern border of Assyria, while Adad-nirari is busy with other matters, probably while he was off fighting and plundering in Hanigalbat. You may remember from last episode that the Babylonians had seen their king die. That wasn't even last episode, that was 2 episodes ago. But the Babylonians had seen their king die, either in battle or shortly after, and the Assyrians had pushed pretty far in as a result. Well, that king's son had been sitting back for a time and planning his revenge, which he then gets in spectacular fashion here at the end of Ashur-Dan's reign. He pushes his army to the north of the lower Zab River, quite close to the Assyrian heartland, before the Assyrian army is able to assemble and turn them back. While the Assyrian records of this campaign claim a victory, they do note that the borderline established here is pretty far north, indicating an overall loss. And the two kingdoms exchanged princesses in marriage to seal an alliance for a generation. Despite the apparent win, Babylon is unquestionably the weaker party at this time, so a favorable peace is a very positive outcome for them. And peace does pertain for quite a while following this. Of course, the consequence of this peace, coupled with the weakness and instability of southern Mesopotamia, is that we're not going to hear a lot about Babylon for the next 80 years or so. Now, having attained peace on all his vastly expanded borders, Adad-nirari spent the last few years engaged in construction activities and tribute tours. Now, these tribute tours were, in a lot of ways, really similar to the conquests, just without so much violence, and instead just the threat of violence. The whole army, or at least a big chunk of the army, would march out in force on these expeditions. But it's assumed that the targets were usually places that had already submitted or which were very likely to submit fully if a small amount of pressure was applied. The Assyrians never apply a small amount of pressure, though, not when they can apply an overwhelming amount instead, and the full army shows up at kingdom after kingdom, demanding all manner of gifts as well as food and lodging for the troops, in exchange for the privilege of submissive peace on the part of the hosts. Now, on these tours, it's typically the case that the precise diplomatic status of exactly none of these kingdoms is clearly stated. Some think that all of these kingdoms that Adad-nirari is showing up to had previously submitted, and this is some sort of like semi-regular check-in. Others would say that none of these kingdoms are formal tributaries, since the formal tributary states are presumably sending in their gifts on a regular basis already. And these are more distant kings being sort of strong-armed into a one-time donation. I would say that from the itinerary of Adad-nirari's march through Hanigalbat, he does stop at places that he had definitely conquered before. But he also stops at places he'd never been before, at least never told us that he'd been before, taking what he can from everywhere as he passes. And at this early phase of history, before the reputation of Assyria had become a lasting and permanent terror on the surrounding nations, it isn't until after he comes home that they realize that this was a tribute collecting venture. Everyone just sort of assumes that they're gonna be attacked if they don't cough up the money. And by that I mean, I think Adad-nirari really did bring his army in the expectation that he might have to clean out some pockets of resistance. I mean, certainly following the Tamanu War, he held control over the region of Hanigalbat, generally speaking. But this was an area of dozens of tiny principalities and tribes, not all of whom had been visited in previous campaigns. As the Romans would say a few hundred years later, if you want peace, prepare for war. And in this show of force, Adad-nirari was able to, apparently, secure the submission of the entire region. If there was any fighting, it was too minor for him to bother recording. This sort of traveling around obviously increased the king's pile of plunder, which he could invest into public works projects back in Ashur. But it was also a diplomatic opportunity to make real relations with the people he was, terrifying into submission. It's likely he planted a number of Assyrians in both the newly formed districts as well as some of the tributary states, partly as state agents and partly as, opportunists exploiting the region for personal gain. And the difference between state agents and opportunists may have been kind of small. Now, these men would have been members of the royal house or of the major houses of Assyria, and their personal gain meant more gain for these houses, meaning that those houses could then be relied on to support the king as a source of family wealth. We have surprisingly little about the internal politics that is foundational to the king. The king doesn't just sit I mean, he does sit at the top of society, but he's not just like floating way up high. There's a whole foundation of various noble houses, some of whom have been wealthy since the time of the Assyrian trading empire well over 1,000 years ago, all of whom provide the administrative and military support that the king needs to accomplish all these remarkable things. Anyway, in 891 BCE, Adad-nirari stopped accomplishing things because he died of natural causes, having expanded the empire more than anyone in the last 2 centuries. He was succeeded peacefully, seemingly, by his son Tukulti-Ninurta II, whose name means "my trust is in Ninurta." Now, we're missing the records from his first few years in power, but there are some suggestions that his inaugural military campaign was either north or east into the mountains to either plunder some horses or protect the tributary who supplied horses to the Assyrian state. I mean, there's no question of whether or not there was an inaugural military campaign. Finding someone to fight in the first year or two is basically a requirement of Assyrian kingship at this point. We assume, without much evidence, that his campaign went at least well enough that he could call it a victory and bring back some plunder, firmly establishing himself as the favorite king of the gods. It's quickly apparent, though, that Tukulti-Ninurta was less warlike than most Assyrian kings. Now, I mean, calling him less warlike than most Assyrians, that still rates him as, a murderous psychopath by modern standards, but his interests are clearly in more peaceful areas. Also, it's in his reign that we start to see the king delegating at the highest level. His father and grandfather may have had important viziers and generals. I mean, we assume that they weren't just doing everything themselves, but we don't hear about anyone they were delegating to. Under Tukulti-Ninurta, however, we hear about a man named Gabi-Ilani Eresh, who would be chief vizier to both Tukulti-Ninurta and his son Ashurnasirpal. Now, we know nothing at all about the vizier's accomplishments, but we do know that he would have a reputation in later generations for competence, and that he would be claimed as a notable ancestor by future government officials. So he was apparently successful enough to found his own little dynasty of scholar officials. Now, even without knowing what Gabi-Ilani Eresh accomplished specifically, just knowing that Tukulti-Ninurta was the sort of king who would seek out and then promote and actively work with highly competent men, it says a lot about his personality. Now, this king still claims the bombast due to Assyrian rulers. He claims to be king of the universe as well as king of Assyria, but it was clearly tempered by something that was perhaps pragmatism and perhaps a touch of humility. Perhaps surprisingly for an Assyrian monarch, he also delegates military campaigns. Now, the early campaigns into the northern mountains are poorly preserved and hard to read, but it appears that while the king himself entered into the mountains with the army on either the first or second expeditions, in the following expedition, there was a fellow named Bialasi, some sort of warlord, apparently too minor for the king to trouble himself with directly, and so he dispatches a general to hunt the man down. Now, the general's name is unreadable, the tablet's damaged, it's B something, some of Ame Baali, and the general reports in a letter to have hunted the enemy down across at least 2 cities, sacking both before finally cornering the enemy. This usual pillaging then occurred. Property, people, and gods alike were all taken and then delivered to Nineveh. Oh, that last bit though, all this stuff being delivered to Nineveh. And that's a quiet and unexplained sea change that's going to affect the whole rest of Assyrian history. Up until now, every Assyrian king has officially resided in the city of Ashur, within spitting distance of the mountain of Ashur, upon which the temple of Ashur sat, blessed by the god Ashur, who ruled over all the people of Ashur. There was, you could say, a certain consistency to the theme here. Assyria was Ashur, whether that meant city, god, people, or king. Tukulti-Ninurta, however, has decided to, at the very least, split his time between Nineveh and Ashur. Now, Nineveh at this point is probably a larger city than Ashur itself. Ashur is actually quite space restricted. It's sitting on a river bend without quite as much space as many of the contemporary major cities. And despite being a capital and a major shrine town, it's never had a huge population. Nineveh is more like the New York City to Ashur's Washington. And if we're right that Tukulti-Ninurta is more of a thinker, builder, and people person, it makes sense that he's more attracted to the larger, busier city. Nineveh, by the way, it's pretty much always been there as a major town in the Assyrian heartland. We just haven't had too much occasion to discuss it before now. Though, like the prophet Jonah, we'll be seeing more of it soon, whether we want to or not. Anyway, following the defeat of the warlord Bialassi, Tukulti-Ninurta then gladly records yet another military expedition which he didn't participate in. He notes that there was a rebellion over somewhere at the foothills of some mountains somewhere, and so the king simply dispatched the army to handle it. The matter was handled, and the defeated foes' silver, gold, and property were simply delivered to the king at his residence in Nineveh. But what was he doing in Nineveh that kept him so busy? I mean, it seems he was building. He solidified the empire administratively. Some of that from central cities, but also some of that on some later expeditions we'll get to in a bit. But he repeats the central empire-building claim of his father almost verbatim. He constructed palaces in the various districts of the land. He hitched up plows and piled up more grain than ever before. The core economic claim he makes is that he added more land and more people to Assyria. And it seems he did do this. But what gets him far more excited are the prestige projects he undertook in both Nineveh and Ashur. He rebuilt a huge terrace around the palace. He added a whole new story onto a major shrine of Ashur. He seems to have built, or at least refurbished and renamed, an entire district in Nineveh, which he names, of course, after himself, because humility is prohibited in Assyrian kings. He also seems to have left behind a fair amount of engraved jewelry, though whether this is because he was more interested in riches, or that he was wealthier, or if we're just entering into a time frame with more recovered artifacts overall, that's really unclear. The engravings on all of these, none of them are terribly illuminating, just the standard great king, strong king, king of the universe, king of Assyria, that kind of thing. But it does let us know that he was firmly in control and quite active over the entire heartland, despite not leading the charge quite as often as we might otherwise have expected. Still, though, don't get the wrong idea, Tukulti-Ninurta was no pacifist. About halfway through his reign, he got a letter from a northern governor that some warlord further north in the mountains was marching south in conquest. Now, these were rich lands up here, some tributaries in need of protecting and others ripe for plunder, So the army marched out from Nineveh at the start of summer, and in a fairly quick campaign established battle lines against the invading foe, smashed them in the field, moved onwards to sack 2 more cities, then reached the headwaters of the Tigris River, where Tukulti-Ninurta erected a statue of himself at the headwaters of the Tigris River to let everyone know that Assyrian might reached even that distant place. Ultimately, the enemy warlord was captured and allowed to live once he had made the proper submission, but much of his tribe was deported into the Assyrian heartland, and the army carried away horses, slaves, and metals in abundance. Of note, it's never clear to me how they decide who is to be a slave and who is to be a deportee among the captive population. We see in accounts such as this that both slaves and deportees are taken on the campaign, but to my knowledge it's never made clear what context each was taken in. Probably because this knowledge was assumed to be widespread at the time. My guess, based on not very much data, is that the slaves were the ones taken during the fighting and the pillaging, whereas the Sabu deportees would be taken only in times of peace, either proactive submissions while on the campaign, people who see the army and they just run out and say, nope, 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 don't fight me, we surrender, or among the people who had been fully beaten into submission in the days and weeks following the pillaging. Anyway, the king took all these prizes with him, along with some of the native gods, and note that we didn't hear about the previous kings bringing gods into Ashur. We kind of assumed they did because it was common practice, but Tukulti-Ninurta makes a point to expressly tell us that he's capturing gods and bringing them to Ashur with all respect. Maybe this is a piety thing, maybe this is his idea of a power move because maybe he's not as much of a fighter as the previous king, so he needs some more divine violence to justify himself. It's not totally clear what he's getting at here. Just an interesting shift in focus. All of these campaign narratives, the language is very similar across the generations, and so we do pull out these specific details to tell us something about the personality of these kings. Anyway, all these campaign reports, once he brings all this stuff into Assyria, he then goes to the Temple of Ashur and sends a campaign report to the god, saying, hey, God Ashur, this is what I've done, this is all the plunder I took. These campaign reports, they seem to have been mandatory, or very close to mandatory, after each major campaign for whole centuries. But we don't hear very much about them prior to this, since sending the report didn't previously involve a whole lot of effort, what with the king formerly having lived just down the street from the Temple of Ashur. Now that the king lives in Nineveh, however, going down to Ashur with all the plunder, that's a bit more of an event, and so we hear about it a bit more often. Now, as soon as the triumphal rituals are completed, now it's the end of summer, or maybe the early fall, and the Assyrian army marches right back out, this time headed up the Greater Zab River to the northeast, where a bunch of Aramaeans were fiendishly existing in violation of the king's desire for them to not exist anymore. So he went up to fix the situation. 30 towns were torched and plundered, and the king claims to have gone places that no Assyrian king had ever gone before, which, given the insignificance of that area generally and the difficulty of the terrain, it's not implausible. Maybe no army had bothered going there before. Now, the army traveled southwards as the people of the region flee before them, collecting plunder as they went, until reaching a point where the chariots could no longer be transported because the mountains were too rough. Just to prove that it could be done, the king ordered the mountain to be scaled on foot with great difficulty, then continued on south. However, this gave the enemy time to flee even further south across the lower Zab River, and rather than further exhaust the army, the king took the lower Zab River back home and called it a day. And this seems to have worked all of Tukulti-Ninurta's manly desire for exploration and adventure clean out of him. He would not, as far as the records show, bother launching any more aggressive conquests. It was basically the end of the year here, and we can pause to note something. The army has just fought through the planting season, which means that Tukulti-Ninurta is now leading a professional army. Now, this isn't Assyria's first professional army. Indeed, we've seen professional corps since the Akkadian Empire, but professional armies were expensive, and it's assumed that the Assyrians probably didn't have one, or really didn't have one of any significant size throughout the Dark Age. There was probably always a core contingent of bodyguards, but now we're some 40 years past the end of the Dark Age, and it seems that the professional corps of the Assyrian army is now large enough that it can be deployed on its own, possibly with either no conscripts supporting it or very few of them. Armies for large campaigns are still accompanied by pretty significant callouts of citizens who will serve a few months at a time as conscript soldiers. But the unusually large professional corps is going to be one of the Assyrian army's defining features, and this is the earliest that we can start to see it in this era of history. Now, we'll be looking in more detail at the Neo-Assyrian army soon, but it's increasingly likely that even though we lack the evidence to say for sure, the army that Tukulti-Ninurta is leading around is substantially similar to the more well-attested army that Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser will be leading to such great success in the next few generations. Anyway, Tukulti-Ninurta is running his professional army ragged, because following this last campaign, he spends barely a few months back in Ashur, then he takes them all out on a massive camping trip. Now, technically, this is a tribute campaign, but the king appears to approach it really like a camping trip, just with some added plunder. Now, here's just one passage from an extremely long account of this trip. I pitched camp and I spent the night in the desert. Moving on from the desert, I crossed the Wadi Thartar. I pitched camp and I spent the night. By midday, all the water had been drawn, and I exhausted 470 water wells in the environs. On the second day at the well, the water was too bitter to satisfy the troops. Moving from the wells, I took to the desert, I pitched camp, and I spent the night by the Wadi Thartar. For 4 days, I followed the banks of the Wadi Thartar, and on my expedition along the banks of the Wadi Thartar, I killed 8 wild bulls. And then I pitched camp, and I spent the night at the mouth of the Wadi Thartar. Water was drawn, but then, moving on from the mouth of Wadi Thartar, I continued through the Hamatu, difficult terrain. In the grasslands, I sighted some streams. The wells around them had all fallen in. Nevertheless, water was very abundant, and I pitched camp and I spent the night. Water was drawn all day and all night, and I approached the Tigris and captured the settlements of the land of the Utu together with their villages, which were situated on the Tigris, and I massacred them and carried off a bunch of booty from them. And then I pitched camp, and I spent the night in the city of Asusu. Moving on from the city of Asusu, on the third day, I continued through the forest without a leader or a guide. Wow! Without a leader or a guide. He just marched on all by himself like a big boy. Plus, hundreds, if not in the low thousands of soldiers at his side, of course. Now, he sounds like he's having the absolute time of his life, going from place to place, slaughtering wild animals, exploring the wilderness, drinking the wells dry, massacring settlements, pitching camp each night. Oh, it's great. It's real romantic, at least in his vision of how it all went down. And it does go on like this for like 100 lines. It's 4 pages of text in the modern translation. And it does get extremely repetitive to read through the whole thing. More pitching tents, more exhausted wells, more towns that no one knows who they are, more hunting, more slaughtering and pillaging, all in exhaustive detail. But though he portrays it in this way, possibly because this really was his intellectual bent, it wasn't just a camping trip. This is the most detailed account yet of what one of the tribute campaigns actually looks like. Perhaps most significant here is that since we have so much detail, we can decently well chart out his course here, and we can see that he's not actually going over places that are already part of the Assyrian Empire, which his father and grandfather had conquered before him. He marches south down the Tigris, then hops over the Euphrates and follows it generally west until he gets to the Khabur River. Then he goes up to Hani Galbat, then he returns, forming a giant clockwise circle. In the process, he is visiting towns which we don't think have ever been visited by an Assyrian king before, or at least not in this period of history, which have never been asked to submit or give tribute. And he's basically just assuming that anywhere he goes, his reputation will have preceded him, and people will house his soldiers, they'll play along with his camping fantasy, and more importantly, they'll give him fistfuls of tribute and submit themselves to the ever-growing empire. As we saw in that extract that I just read, not every town was quite so accommodating. But though he likely marched with only the professional corps of the army, not a full conquest force, he didn't get hung up anywhere putting down resistant towns. Of note with these tribute campaigns, no one is drawing up any territory maps here. And as far as we can tell, most of these submissions did not involve a treaty, not at this point. Instead, the people of the time think of it more like this. There are these particular major rulers on the middle Euphrates River. All or most of these rulers have, as a people, given submission to the Assyrian Empire. Therefore, the entire middle Euphrates River region has submitted to the Assyrian Empire, and therefore the Assyrian kings can in the future demand whatever they want from anywhere in the region. There is an implicit promise that the Assyrian kings would, in exchange, protect the tributary region from external threats, but it isn't so much that the king is binding himself in these informal cases to guaranteeing the protection of his lessers, but it seems instead that the submitting lords are simply relying on the fact that the Assyrian king wants to keep getting tribute from these people, and can only keep getting it as long as they're not invaded. Plus, the king, might feel like his honor is diminished if parts of his territory are overrun by evil barbarians. And so it's in this way that Tukulti-Ninurta camped his way west to somewhat expand the empire. Meeting with all these vassal kings, simply having the court out west for an extended period, would allow him to arrange the diplomacy and administration of the still newly conquered region. And so he's mostly remembered as a stabilizing influence on the nascent empire. He wasn't some bum who failed to accomplish as much as his father had. He was a necessary pause in the march of expansion. He set the precedent that the king doesn't need to live in Ashur. He allowed the pre-existing processes of assimilation, construction, and administration to have some stability and some time to work. And he manifestly did his duty before all the gods, especially before the great high god Ashur. And so, by the standards of the day, Tukulti-Ninurta did pretty well. His son, though, is just going to blow him out of the water. Like, Not even close. Tukulti-Ninurta gets ignored because of how amazing the next guy is. So join us next time as we transform fully into a military empire to make the earth quake and start the period of Assyrian history where we can really get into more extremely bloody detail on a lot more stuff. Thank you for listening.